I recently was talking to my son Adam about heroes in life, and I gave it some thought. And I told him I was going to put something together about one of my heroes, and that would be my dad. Now, you might think that's sort of self-serving, but he truly was a hero, especially in my eyes, and maybe into some others too. He lived during the Second World War. Prior to the war, Dad had gone to Dunwoody Institute in Minneapolis and took everything they had mechanical. So when the war broke out, he tried to enlist, but couldn't. He was just a little bit too old, and he had two kids already, so he missed the first wave of draft. In the meantime, Boeing Aircraft had gotten a contract from the U.S. government saying they wanted some long-range bombers. Long-range bombers were sort of new to the aeronautics world. We had plenty of good warplanes. The B-29, as an example, was made by Boeing, and it worked just fine for the European theater, where everything was closer together. But now we're confronted with an adversary, the Japanese. And if you look at a globe or a map, you can see that Japan is way out in the middle of the ocean. On one side, it's all water, and the other direction gets closer to Asia, China, and so forth. But there's a mountainous region there and no place to put an airfield. So they were presented with the problem of building a long-range bomber, something that they could get to Japan with. General Doolittle, or I think he probably wasn't a general then yet, but Jimmy Doolittle led a raid early in the war, right after Pearl Harbor, and they managed to get to Japan. They took off from aircraft carriers with a plane big enough to carry bombardment equipment and fuel to get to Japan, but they couldn't land on that same aircraft because the plane was too big to do any landing, but you could take off from it. So they took off from the aircraft carrier, got to Japan, and sent them a message that we will fight back, and that made it a success. However, it wasn't a success because none of those planes made it back to safety. They tried to make it to different parts of Asia, China. One of the planes made it to Russia and crash landed, and the others crash landed in mostly in China someplace, because they couldn't find a place to land. So in that respect, it wasn't a success, but morally it was a successful thing. But it brought the message to the American government that we need a long-range bomber, something that can take off from many, many miles away and make it back again. And that's when Boeing was instructed to build a long-range bomber. Dad got a call one day. He had graduated from Dunwoody, was working in New Ulm, Minnesota, and had started a family, myself included, and got a call from Boeing, and they were recruiting people and building buildings. They had to start almost from scratch. Now, Boeing already was building airplanes, but nothing of the size of the B-29. They called it a super fortress. the B-29, and they needed people. They had contacted Dunwoody and asked if there was any recent graduates with mechanical skills. Dunwoody gave Boeing my dad's name, and over the phone they called him and offered him a job. He took it, packed up his family, and was on the way. He had asked them, "When do I start?" And they said, "As soon as you can get here." His badge number was, I believe, 82, his employment badge with Boeing. Now, when you consider the tens of thousands of people that have worked for Boeing, that was a pretty low number. So it does mean he was one of the originals. Matter of fact, we got to Kansas, where Boeing manufacturing is. It's actually in Plainview, Kansas. However, most people know it as Wichita. Plainview is a suburb, I guess, of Wichita. And there was no housing. We had to stay in Wichita for a couple of months while they built employee housing for government-owned housing for the people to live in. And they had to build these super big hangars that would accommodate a big airplane. Dad was in on all of that, being one of the first. And there was never any models, or they do wind tests on airplanes and so forth now, but everything was trial and error in building these huge airplanes. One of the first things that Dad was issued was a Cushman scooter, these little red two-wheel scooters. And the idea of that was they didn't want him spending all of his time walking because everything was so big. The hangars were huge, the planes were big, and for him to get from one to the other, he would spend his whole day just walking between them. So they issued him a scooter so he could coordinate between all of the planes that were being built and the engineers and designers. He was kind of the liaison between everybody. They called him a foreman, but it was because he had to have some authority. Now, being one of the first there, he was issued several, what would they call it, job descriptions, and several things he was in charge of. He was trained as a fireman, as an example, because they needed to have a in-house fire department.